Have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere simply because of the way you look? Picture this: a black woman walks onto a plane, first-class ticket in hand, only to find her seat already taken. The woman sitting there refuses to move. The crew hesitates, and in that tense silence, dignity hangs in the balance. What would you do? Stay quiet to avoid a scene, or stand your ground and risk being humiliated? But here's the twist. The woman denied her seat is not just any passenger. She is the CEO, and not just the CEO, but the majority owner of the very airline flying that plane. Imagine the shock, the reversal, the moment when arrogance collides head-on with truth. If it were you, would you fight, forgive, or use that moment to change an entire system? This is not just a story about one flight. It's about every time someone has been told they don't belong, and every choice to answer with strength instead of surrender. Stay with me, because once you hear what happened next, you'll never look at a boarding gate the same way again. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the journey ahead. The morning air at Dallas-Fort Worth carried that mix of jet fuel, coffee, and human anticipation. Travelers pulled rolling bags across the polished floor. Families hurried to gates. Business flyers scrolled through emails on their phones. Among them walked Elena Brooks, dressed in a simple navy suit. Nothing flashy, no entourage, just a leather carry-on slung over her shoulder and a boarding pass in her hand. To anyone watching, she looked like another frequent flyer. Few would guess that Elena was the majority owner and chief executive officer of GlobalAir, one of the fastest-growing airlines in America. Elena had chosen to travel without assistants or bodyguards. She preferred it that way. It kept her grounded. It reminded her of her grandmother, who used to scrub airplane cabins for a living. "Never forget the floor you came from," her grandmother would say. At gate C-17, the agent scanned boarding passes with that practiced smile. "First-class passengers. You may board now." Elena stepped forward, her pass in hand. But just as she reached the jet bridge, she noticed something. Seat 1C. Her seat was already occupied. A woman sat there, adjusting her pearl necklace, tapping impatiently at her phone, blonde hair styled perfectly, handbag perched like it deserved its own ticket. Elena checked her boarding pass again. Row 1, seat C, no mistake. She approached calmly. "Excuse me, ma'am, I believe you're in my seat." The woman looked up, eyes narrowing. Clara Whitmore, old Dallas money, known in social circles, often quoted in glossy magazines for her charity galas and sharp business deals. Clara gave a thin smile. "I don't think so. This is seat 1C. "Yes," Elena replied softly. She held out her boarding pass. "That's the one printed here." Clara didn't even glance at it. She leaned back, crossing her legs, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. "You must be mistaken. This seat isn't for you." The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder. A hush fell over the row. One passenger coughed awkwardly. Another pretended to check his phone but angled it just enough to record video. The gate agent hurried over, whispering nervously, "Ms. Whitmore, maybe there's been a mix-up. Ms. Brooks, perhaps we can seat you in 3A instead." Elena looked at the agent, then at Clara. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes were steady, her breath even. Inside, though, A memory flickered. Her grandmother bent over an airplane floor, scrubbing gum from the carpet, invisible to passengers who never said thank you. Elena could have revealed her identity right then. Could have said, "I own this airline. You're in my seat because I paid for the entire plane. Not just 1C, but she didn't. Not yet." She gave the faintest nod. "I'll take 3A. Gasps rippled among a few watching. Clara smirked, satisfied, sipping her champagne as if victory tasted sweet. Elena walked down the aisle, past curious eyes, and slid into the smaller seat. She set her carry-on neatly under the chair, buckled the belt, and pulled out a small notebook. To anyone else, she looked serene. But under the calm surface, a storm brewed. Why didn't I speak, she wondered. Why did I let her words pass unchecked? The plane pushed back from the gate. Engines roared. Elena opened her notebook, where she often jotted stray thoughts. She wrote one line, pressing the pen so hard it nearly tore the page. At what point does silence become complicity? The flight attendant announced takeoff. Elena leaned back, closing her eyes, steadying her breath. She reminded herself patience was power. Timing mattered more than impulse. As the plane climbed through the clouds, the cabin lights flickered. A murmur of unease passed through passengers. One of the attendants frowned, tapping the panel above the galley. Electrical glitch, minor, but enough to rattle nerves. Elena unbuckled quietly, walked up to the galley, and whispered to the crew, "Check the auxiliary breaker above the aft jump seat, reset it, then cycle the lighting circuit. It's a known quirk on the A320. The attendant blinked. "How do you—" "Just trust me." He followed her instructions. Within seconds, the lights steadied, the cabin relaxed. The crew thanked her softly, but Clara's voice rang out from the front. Some people really should stay in their seats. Laughter from a couple of passengers followed. Elena didn't answer. She returned to her seat, opened her notebook again, and wrote another line. Dignity isn't about the seat you sit in. It's about whether you stand up for yourself, even when you don't speak. For the rest of the flight, she stayed silent. Let Clara enjoy her illusion of victory. Let the cameras record. Elena knew something Clara didn't. The plane would land, the world would see, and when truth came, it would not whisper, it would roar. The engines steadied as the plane reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers stretched, reached for headphones, ordered drinks. A hum of conversations filled the cabin, that low drone of strangers in a temporary skybound community. From her seat in 3A, Elena Brooks kept her gaze on the window. The clouds rolled beneath them like a white ocean, sunlight striking silver off their peaks. She had always loved this view ever since she was a girl who could only dream of flight. Yet today, it carried a sting. She could still hear Clara Whitmore's words echoing in her mind. "This seat isn't for you." It wasn't the words themselves. Elena thought. It was the certainty behind them. The certainty that someone like Elena couldn't possibly belong in 1C, in the front row, in the place of power. A flight attendant approached with a tray. Champagne. "Ma'am." Elena smiled politely. "Just water, thank you." The attendant set the glass down, pausing a moment. Her eyes flickered with recognition like she knew who Elena was but couldn't quite believe it. She moved on quickly, saying nothing. Across the aisle, a young man angled his phone carefully. Elena glimpsed the red recording light. Already, the moment had left the confines of the cabin. Already, it was slipping into the boundless public square of social media. Elena took a slow sip of water. She wondered how it would be framed. Black woman denied her seat, or maybe socialite put stranger in her place. She knew the headlines before they were written. She had lived them before. A memory surfaced. Uninvited Elena, 26 years old. Her first management job at an airline logistics firm. She had walked into a boardroom only to be asked to fetch coffee. No one believed she was the one leading the meeting. It took years, countless sleepless nights, and sheer defiance to climb past that ceiling. Now she was at 35,000 feet, and the ceiling looked different, but it pressed just as hard. Clara rang her call button. "Excuse me," she said loudly when the attendant came. "My champagne isn't cold enough. Can you bring me another? And while you're at it, make sure," she waved a manicured hand toward Elena, "that passengers stay where they belong." The words landed like a slap. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. Inside, her mind raced. Why am I letting this continue? Why am I allowing this woman to dictate my silence? The answer came back, heavy, because every move I make will be judged not just as me, but as every black woman who dares to sit in a first-class seat. My anger will not be read as righteous. It will be read as dangerous. She breathed slowly, willing herself to patience. Timing mattered. The hours dragged. Dinner was served. Clara complained about the salmon. Clara asked the attendant to refill her glass again and again. At one point, she leaned over the aisle, eyes glittering. "You seem awfully calm back there," Clara said, voice syrupy with condescension. "Not many people would give up their seat so easily, almost like you knew you didn't deserve it." Elena looked at her evenly. Her voice was soft, but every word was deliberate. Calm isn't surrender, and dignity doesn't ask permission. Clara blinked, unsettled for a brief moment, then forced a laugh. "Whatever you say, dear." The passengers nearby heard it. Some recorded. Some looked away, ashamed. The cabin lights dimmed for the overnight flight. Darkness settled, pierced by the glow of reading lamps. Elena closed her eyes, though sleep wouldn't come. Her notebook lay open on her lap, a blank page waiting. She wrote 3 words, grace over fury. Her grandmother's voice returned, as if carried by the hum of the engines. "Baby girl, sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the preparation for a stronger voice." Still. Elena wrestled with doubt. Was her silence protecting her people or betraying them? Was patience, strength, or cowardice? The hours crawled by until the announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending into New York shortly." The cabin stirred awake. Clara reapplied lipstick in a compact mirror, preparing her face for the arrival she thought she owned. Elena gathered her bag, notebook tucked carefully inside. The plane touched down with a shudder. Applause scattered through the cabin, as it sometimes does. Passengers stood, retrieving bags, stretching stiff legs. Clara rose gracefully, adjusting her jacket, and turned to Elena with that same condescending smile. "Safe travels," she said. "And remember, dear, Some seats just aren't meant for everyone. Elena held her gaze, her voice calm but edged with steel. You're right. Some seats aren't meant for everyone. Some of them have to be earned. Clara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered, brushing past, certain the story was finished. It wasn't. The jet bridge opened to the terminal. Cameras waited, not just phones now, but reporters who had caught the viral spark midair. Microphones lifted. Ms. Brooks, Ms. Brooks. Clara turned, startled. The reporters weren't calling her name. They were calling Elena's. Elena stepped forward into the light of the terminal. For the first time since boarding, she allowed the truth to surface. I am Elena Brooks, she said clearly, owner and chief executive officer of GlobalAir, and the seat I was denied today was on my own airline. Gasps. Camera flashes. Clara froze, face draining of color. The silence broke like glass. Reporters shouted questions. Passengers who had filmed the exchange uploaded their clips with captions, "She owns the airline." Elena's calm remained unshaken. She lifted her chin, eyes sweeping across the crowd. This is not just about me, she said, voice steady. It is about every traveler told they don't belong, every employee overlooked because of prejudice, every child who dreams of flying but is told their wings are not welcome. The words rang through the terminal. Some clapped, some wept. Clara slipped into the crowd, shrinking under the weight of recognition. The power she had wielded in 1C had evaporated, replaced by shame. Elena stood firm, her notebook in hand. The storm she had carried silently through the flight had broken, not with fury, but with truth. And the world was listening. That night, the clips reached millions. Hashtags trended. Commentators debated. Some called Elena a hero of dignity. Others accused her of weakness for not confronting Clara sooner. But no one denied the impact. In living rooms and break rooms, in classrooms and boardrooms, people repeated Elena's words. Calm isn't surrender. Dignity doesn't ask permission. The story was only beginning, but for Elena, one truth had crystallized at 35,000 feet. Keeping your seat wasn't just about staying in place. Sometimes it was about knowing when to rise so others could finally see. The next morning, the storm had grown. Every major network replayed the clips from Flight 227. The video of Clara Whitmore refusing to leave 1C looped endlessly, her voice sharp, Elena's silence unyielding. And then the reveal at the terminal that shattered the illusion. I am Elena Brooks, owner and chief executive officer of GlobalAir. By dawn, hashtags trended across the nation. She owns the airline. Moss seat 2027, Dignity Flight. Some called Elena a symbol of poise under pressure. Others questioned why she hadn't spoken sooner. Talk shows buzzed with divided takes. Was her patience grace, or was it weakness? Elena sat in her office on the 32nd floor of GlobalAir headquarters, overlooking the Dallas skyline. Her chief of staff, Marcus Reed, stood by the window, phone in hand. They're asking for a statement, he said. Every outlet, CNN, The Times, even international press. We can't stay silent. Elena closed her notebook where last night she had written only one line. Truth roars louder than fury. Schedule a press conference, she said quietly. This afternoon. No scripts, just the truth. Marcus hesitated. Elena, this could go either way. You'll be praised by some, attacked by others. Investors are nervous. Clara Whitmore's family's already making calls. They're saying you staged the whole thing for publicity." Elena looked up, her gaze steady. "Then it's time we decide what kind of company we are. One that hides behind numbers, or one that stands for dignity." The press conference was set for 2 p.m. The auditorium filled quickly. Journalists, cameras, employees, even passengers from yesterday's flight who had come forward to give their accounts. Elena walked onto the stage. Simple black dress. No jewelry except a silver pendant her grandmother had given her. She carried no notes, no prepared remarks, only her notebook tucked under her arm. The room fell silent. "Yesterday," she began, her voice calm but carrying. "I boarded one of my company's planes. I held a ticket for seat 1C, and I was told, in front of a cabin full of witnesses, that the seat wasn't for me." Murmurs rippled, cameras clicked. I chose silence on that flight, not because I agreed, not because I was weak, but because sometimes silence is the canvas on which the truth paints itself. And when we landed, the truth was undeniable. She paused, letting the words sink in. This wasn't just about me. It was about every traveler told they don't belong. Every employee passed over because of bias. Every dream clipped before takeoff. Yesterday was a mirror, and America saw itself reflected in it. A hand shot up. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal. "Ms. Brooks, critics say your decision to stay silent during the flight made you complicit, that you allowed discrimination to play out unchecked." Elena's jaw tightened, but she answered evenly. "Do we ask victims to shout while their dignity is being stripped? Or do we ask why others stayed silent when they saw it happen? I wasn't complicit. I was patient. And patience gave the world a clear view of the injustice." Applause broke out from a section of employees seated in the back. Another question came. What about Clara Whitmore? She claimed she didn't know who you were, that this was just a misunderstanding. Elena nodded slightly. She's right about one thing: she didn't know who I was. But that's exactly the problem. She assumed who I wasn't. And that assumption is what millions of people face every day. In airports, in offices, in classrooms. That assumption is the weight we carry. The words hit hard. Even some of the reporters lowered their pens, listening more as humans than professionals. The press conference continued for nearly an hour. Elena answered every question with clarity and calm. When asked what GlobalAir would do in response, she laid it out. "We will launch the Dignity in Flight Initiative. Every employee, from executives to gate agents, will undergo bias training. We will create a passenger advocate program to handle complaints of discrimination in real time. And we will publish quarterly transparency reports so the public can hold us accountable." The room erupted in murmurs again. It was bold, risky, and unlike anything an airline had done before. A final question came from a young reporter in the back. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Ms. Brooks, what gave you the strength to stand in silence yesterday?" Elena's eyes softened. She opened her notebook, reading a line written years ago in her grandmother's handwriting. "Grace is not weakness. Grace is strength refusing to be poisoned by hate." She closed the book. "That's what gave me strength." The press conference ended, but the debate had only begun. By evening, pundits filled the airwaves. Some praised Elena as a visionary leader, elevating dignity into corporate culture. Others blasted her for bringing social politics into business. At GlobalAir headquarters, employees gathered in break rooms watching the replay. Some cried quietly. For many, it was the first time they had seen their CEO not just as a business leader, but as someone carrying the same burdens they did. But outside, Clara Whitmore and her family waged their own campaign. Her brother, Richard Whitmore, a powerful financier, went on television claiming Elena had humiliated Clara unfairly. This wasn't racism, Richard declared. It was a simple seat mix-up. Elena Brooks is exploiting it to push her personal agenda, and that makes her unfit to run GlobalAir. The words stung, but Elena knew the fight was shifting. It wasn't just about one seat anymore. It was about who controlled the narrative and the future of the airline. That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment. The city lights flickered through the window. Her notebook lay open again. She wrote, "Justice without grace becomes revenge. Grace without justice becomes surrender. The balance is everything." Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus investors want a meeting tomorrow. Some are wavering. Steinberg is making calls. Elena closed the notebook slowly. The storm was no longer just public opinion. It was inside the boardroom now, and she knew the real battle was only beginning. The following week brought no calm. The story of Flight 227 had stretched into something larger than a news cycle. Editorials debated whether Elena Brooks was ushering in a new era of corporate accountability or dragging business into what critics called identity politics. Stock prices bobbed up and down like restless tides. Employees received both praise and hate mail for working at GlobalAir. Inside headquarters, tension pressed against every wall. Elena spent her days in back-to-back meetings with lawyers, public relations advisors, and executives. At night, she returned to her apartment with only silence for company, her notebook always at her side. One Tuesday morning, Marcus Reed stepped into her office with a folder in hand. His face carried that mixture of hesitation and urgency she had come to recognize. "Elena," he began, "there's something you need to see." It came through the Royce Fellowship application portal this morning. The Royce Fellowship, a program Elena had founded 2 years earlier, named after her grandmother. 50 scholarships each year for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation pilots, engineers, mechanics, designers. It was one of the legacies she cherished most. Elena gestured for Marcus to hand her the folder. She opened it carefully, scanning the neatly typed application, high grades, top scores, a personal essay about the first time the applicant saw an airplane up close, how the roar of the engines felt like possibility made real. Elena felt something stir in her chest as she read. The words were raw, passionate, written with the kind of fire she recognized from her own youth. But then she reached the name at the top, Emma Whitmore. Her hand froze. The last name glared back at her. Whitmore. She looked up sharply. "Is this?" Marcus nodded. "Clara's daughter." Elena shut the folder. The office felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls were inching closer. She rose from her chair, pacing to the window. She applied, "Knowing who I am," Elena said quietly. "Knowing what happened, or maybe she applied despite it," Marcus offered. "The essay doesn't mention you. It's just about her love for flying." Elena exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling in her bones. The fellowship was sacred, designed to open doors for those history had locked out. But Emma was the daughter of the very family that had humiliated her. That afternoon, Elena convened the fellowship selection committee. 5 members, all accomplished professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. She handed them Emma's file without comment. Dr. Lucia Martinez, an aerospace engineer, spoke first. "This candidate is exceptional. Her scores are top across the board. And this essay, it's powerful. You can feel the genuine passion." Jerome Washington, a retired Air Force pilot, frowned. "I don't care how good her essay is. That name carries weight. Whitmore, those spots are for kids who've been kept out. Not for the children of those who did the keeping." Patricia Kim, an aviation attorney, adjusted her glasses. "But she didn't do anything wrong. Can we punish a daughter for her mother's actions?" Jerome shook his head. "It's not punishment, it's prioritization. Every spot she takes is one a black or brown kid doesn't get." The room filled with overlapping voices, sharp with emotion. Some argued Emma deserved the chance on merit. Others insisted the fellowship had a purpose larger than grades. Elena listened, silent at first, but then she raised her hand and the room quieted. "What if," she said slowly, "we created an additional spot, funded separately, not taken away from the 50, a 51st fellowship just for her?" Jerome's voice was incredulous. That would be seen as forgiveness, as weakness, or as strength. Patricia countered softly, "As proof that transformation is possible, even for those tied to those who've wronged us." The debate raged for hours. Voices rose, tempers flared. At one point, Jerome stood and announced, "If you go through with this, I'll resign." That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She drove to the cemetery where her grandmother was buried. She sat by the headstone, the cool night air heavy with questions. "They all have a point, Grandma," she whispered. "Every argument for and against. How do I choose between justice and mercy? How do I fight for our people while showing that we're better than those who tried to hold us down?" The wind rustled through the trees, carrying an echo of her grandmother's voice. Grace isn't weakness. It's strength refusing to be poisoned by resentment. Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She pressed her hand against the stone. Then grace it is. The next day, she called a press conference. In front of reporters and cameras, she announced the 50 recipients of the Royce Fellowship. Each name drew applause, each story a triumph. Then she paused. "There is a 51st recipient this year," she said. "Funded from my personal funds, not taking a spot from anyone else. Her name is Emma Whitmore." The gasp from the reporters was audible. Hands shot up with questions, but Elena continued. "Yes, she is Clara Whitmore's daughter. Yes, I know what that means. But Emma Whitmore didn't choose her mother any more than I chose the color of my skin. What she did choose was to love aviation, to excel academically, and to apply, knowing her name might count against her." A reporter called out, Ms. Brooks, aren't you rewarding the family that humiliated you? Elena's voice was steady. I'm not rewarding a family. I'm investing in a young woman who deserves a chance. If we claim to be building a better world, that world must include the possibility of redemption even for the children of those who wronged us. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Social media exploded with accusations. Some called Elena naive. Others accused her of going soft, of letting privilege win again. True to his word, Jerome Washington resigned from the committee in protest. But Dr. Martinez stayed, telling reporters, if we become what we fought against, we've won nothing. 3 days later, Emma Whitmore appeared at Elena's office. She was tall like her mother, but her features were softer. Her eyes held uncertainty rather than entitlement. I didn't ask for this, Emma said immediately. I don't want to be your token act of forgiveness. Elena gestured for her to sit. Do you know why I gave you this fellowship to prove you're better than my mother? No. I gave it to you because you wrote that flying makes you feel free, and everyone deserves to feel free. I gave it to you because your grades earned it, and I gave it to you because grace isn't just a word, it's an action. Emma's eyes glistened. People hate you for it, even your own supporters. Some do, Elena admitted, but others understand. If we only help those who look like us, think like us, come from where we come from, we're just building new walls to replace the old ones. Emma hesitated, then whispered, My mother is dying. Elena's breath caught. She told me not to accept the fellowship, said it would taint everything I achieved after. But I told her, at least this way, I can try to turn it into something else, something better. Elena studied her carefully. She saw no entitlement in Emma, only the weight of responsibility. There will be conditions, Elena said firmly. You'll mentor young black students. You'll volunteer in underserved communities. You'll use your privilege to open doors for others. Emma nodded. I understand. Elena leaned forward. This isn't charity, it's investment. I'm investing in the person you could become, not compensating for the person your mother was. Emma swallowed hard. Then I won't waste it. As Emma rose to leave, she turned back. My mother wants to see you, she said, to tell you it's important. Elena's heart tightened. She knew this story wasn't finished. The past had a way of demanding to be faced, one way or another. The hospice room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Curtains muted the afternoon light, wrapping the space in a soft, weary glow. Machines hummed low and steady, their rhythms a reminder that time here was measured in heartbeats slipping away. Elena Brooks stood by the door, unsure for once of her footing. She had stood in boardrooms filled with billionaires, faced reporters armed with barbed questions, even endured humiliation at 35,000 feet. But this, walking into the room of Clara Whitmore's sister, Victoria Whitmore. The woman who had once claimed Elena's seat felt different. On the bed lay a shadow of the woman the world remembered. Victoria's hair was thin, her once commanding frame now fragile under the blanket. Her eyes, though dulled by illness, still carried sparks of recognition when they landed on Elena. Thank you for coming, Victoria whispered, her voice a rasp carried by effort. Elena approached slowly, setting her notebook on the bedside table. "Emma said you wanted to see me." Victoria's lips curved faintly. "Emma. She's stronger than I ever was. I told her not to accept your fellowship, you know. I told her it would stain everything she tried to build, and yet she did." Elena replied, "Because she wants to make something better of it." Silence lingered, broken only by the hiss of oxygen. Victoria reached for a folder on the table with trembling fingers. Elena hesitated, then handed it to her. Inside was a manuscript, hundreds of pages bound together. The title read, "Seat to be Reckoned With." Elena raised an eyebrow. "A memoir, not an apology," Victoria said quickly, breath-catching. "An autopsy of privilege, of blindness, of the thousand small cruelties that led to one very public one." Elena flipped through pages chapter titles like "The Comfortable Blindness," "The Cost of Superiority," "Learning to See." Each line appeared handwritten in ink that wavered with fatigue, but not with intent. "I wanted your permission," Victoria said, eyes closing briefly. "Half the proceeds to your fellowship, half to families I've wronged. There are many, too many. You don't need my permission to publish." Elena said, "I do, because without your blessing, the world will dismiss it as bitterness. With your blessing, maybe it becomes something more than my shame." Elena studied her, conflicted. Here was the woman who had sneered that seat. 1C wasn't for her. Here was the same voice that had sparked humiliation turned reckoning. And now that voice, weakened by disease, asked for partnership. Victoria coughed, her hand trembling as she wiped her lips. "There's more. Richard." Elena stiffened. "Your brother Victoria nodded. He came here, offered me experimental treatment, on one condition that I recant my video, that I say you coerced me, humiliated me into silence. He wanted ammunition to sue you. I told him to go to hell, but he's planning something. He mentioned the medal ceremony." Elena's chest tightened. The Presidential Medal of Freedom. She was set to receive it in 3 days for her leadership, her reforms, her stand on Flight 227. What is he planning? I don't know. But Richard doesn't bluff. He said he would use the board against you. That investors already whisper you've lost focus. Elena closed the manuscript, her reflection caught in the glossy cover. She thought of the storm still swirling online, of investors wavering, of Jerome's resignation, of Emma's fragile hope. "You came here for redemption," Elena said softly, "but you're giving me a warning instead." "Redemption is too grand a word," Victoria replied, her voice barely more than breath. "Correction. Maybe. A correction for the balance I spent my life tilting the wrong way." The weight of her words sank deep. Elena remembered her grandmother scrubbing airplane floors. She remembered the sting of being mistaken for an assistant in her own boardroom. And now, here was a woman from the other side of the equation, broken, dying, but finally seeing. Elena rose, clutching the manuscript. "I'll read it, and I'll decide." As she turned to leave, Victoria's frail voice followed her. "Whatever you decide, be careful. Richard's not finished." Outside, Emma waited in the hall, arms crossed tightly. She looked up, eyes searching Elena's face for clues. "She told you, didn't she?" Emma asked. Elena nodded. "She did. Emma exhaled shakily. She wants that book published. Says it's the only way her life meant anything in the end. Do you believe her? Elena asked. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. I believe she changed. But I don't know if the world will let her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The air smelled of antiseptic and endings. That night, Elena sat at her kitchen table, the manuscript spread before her. She read until dawn, through confessions of arrogance, chapters about inherited entitlement, stories of dinners where servants went unseen. The words were ugly in their honesty, and strangely, that made them powerful. By sunrise, Elena closed the final page, tears burning her eyes. She wrote in her notebook, truth, even ugly truth, can heal, but only if we dare to face it. The next day, she called Marcus into her office. If I publish this, it will shake everything. It will give ammunition to our enemies, but it may also open eyes. Marcus studied her. What does your gut say that the world doesn't need another polished apology? It needs honesty, even from the people we least want to hear it from. Marcus nodded slowly. Then we stand with it, but we prepare for Richard's strike. The medal ceremony drew closer. Invitations went out. Rehearsals were held. Elena practiced her speech quietly at night, though her mind was rarely on the words. She saw Richard in every shadow, felt the weight of his threat in every pause. 2 nights before the ceremony, Emma called her in tears. She collapsed. Emma said, "The doctors don't think she'll make it to the end of the week." Elena drove to the hospice immediately. Victoria's breaths were shallow, her skin pale. Yet when her eyes fluttered open and found Elena, they sparked with a last flicker of purpose. "The book," Victoria whispered, "publish it. Let it help others see what I was too blind to see." Elena clasped her hand. "I will." Victoria's grip was weak but insistent. "Your grandmother, you said she cleaned houses like mine. Wherever she is, I hope she knows her granddaughter didn't just keep her seat. She changed who gets to sit where." Tears blurred Elena's vision. For once, words failed her. That night, Victoria Whitmore died surrounded by her daughters and, unexpectedly, by the woman she had once tried to humiliate. The manuscript remained on Elena's desk, now a legacy waiting to be released, but Richard's shadow loomed larger. The medal ceremony was 2 days away, and Elena knew the next battle wouldn't be fought in the skies or in a press room. It would be fought in the boardroom and in the court of public opinion. The morning of the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony arrived crisp and clear. The rose garden was set with rows of white chairs, flags fluttering in the September air, a podium gleaming in the sunlight. Dignitaries filed in, journalists positioned themselves with cameras, and the hum of anticipation swelled. But at GlobalAir headquarters in Dallas, a different kind of gathering brewed. Richard Whitmore had called for an emergency shareholders meeting, citing leadership crisis as his reason. Normally, such a meeting required 30 days' notice. But he invoked an obscure clause in the bylaws if the CEO endangered fiduciary responsibility. The board could act immediately. Richard's strategy was simple use. Elena's decision to fund Emma Whitmore's fellowship as evidence of reckless personal agenda, combine it with the turbulence of public backlash and jittery investors, and he could topple her while she stood in Washington, metal in hand, unable to fight back. Elena knew this. She had been warned. And so, the night before, she had ordered Marcus to arrange a video conference. If Richard wanted a battle, she would meet him on both fronts at 9 a.m. Elena dressed carefully in her hotel suite overlooking the Potomac. Her team waited nervously, watching her pin the silver pendant from her grandmother to her dress. She turned to Marcus, who had flown with her. "Set it up," she said. Within minutes, 12 faces filled the laptop screen. Board members, investors, and at the center, Richard Whitmore, his expression smug, his tie perfectly knotted. "I'll make this simple," Richard began, voice smooth as glass. "Elena Brooks has lost perspective by giving a fellowship to the daughter of a woman who humiliated her. She proved she prioritizes personal theatrics over fiduciary duty. The company's reputation is bleeding. The stock wavers. Investors are nervous. She is no longer fit to lead." Several heads nodded, the weight of his words carrying. Elena let the silence stretch before speaking. "Richard is right about one thing," she said evenly. "This decision was controversial. Grace always is. But let me be clear, I did not take a fellowship away from anyone. I funded an additional one, personally. If this is what Richard calls reckless, then I am guilty of believing that a young woman should not be punished for her mother's sins." A murmur ran through the room. One board member, Margaret Thompson, leaned forward. "Elena, I respect your conviction, but many of us struggled to understand this choice. Investors have been calling nonstop." Elena met her gaze. "Then let me make it plain. If we cannot show grace to an innocent student, what kind of company are we building? One that values fear over fairness, one that bends to resentment instead of leading with vision." Richard cut in sharply. "Vision doesn't pay dividends. Investors want stability, not sermons. Your job is to grow this airline, not play moral philosopher." Elena didn't flinch. "You confuse stability with stagnation. This airline is growing because we dared to change, because we treated passengers with dignity, even when it cost us, because we proved compassion is not liability, it is a strength." James Worthington, another shareholder, cleared his throat. "My daughter saw the fellowship announcement. She read Emma Whitmore's essay. She said it made her cry. She told me, 'Grace is harder than grudges.' Dad, that's why it matters more." Richard's jaw tightened. "Your daughter doesn't run a multi-billion-dollar company." "No," Worthington said calmly. "But one day she'll inherit my shares. And she told me if I side with you, Richard, she'll sell every one of them the moment she takes control." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Richard's confidence flickered. Elena seized the moment. "You all have a choice. Stand with Richard, who wants to drag us back into an old order of fear and resentment, or stand with me, who believes dignity and grace are not just ideals, they are the foundation of lasting success." The vote was called. Names were read, one by one. Voices declared their side. When it was over, the tally stood 7-5. Richard had lost. His face darkened, his voice low with venom. "This isn't over." "No," Elena said softly, "but your way of thinking is." She closed the laptop. The room in Washington was silent, her team watching her with awe. Marcus exhaled slowly. You just won a war before breakfast. Elena smiled faintly. Now, let's win the other one. At noon, the ceremony began. The president spoke about courage, about leadership that challenged the status quo, about the power of one woman to turn humiliation into transformation. Then Elena stepped to the podium. She looked out over the sea of faces, politicians, journalists, students, employees. She saw Emma in the crowd, standing tall. She saw Marcus. She saw Margaret Thompson. And in the back, in a wheelchair, a blanket draped over her frail frame, Victoria Whitmore, who had checked herself out of hospice against medical advice to be there. Elena began. 6 months ago, I just wanted to sit in seat 1C and fly to New York. What followed has been called a movement, a reckoning, a revolution, but for me, it was simpler. It was about dignity, the dignity we all deserve, regardless of who we are or where we come from. She paused, the words hanging in the crisp air. But dignity without grace becomes rigid, and justice without mercy becomes revenge. If we are to build a better future, it must be one where grace is not weakness, but strength, where transformation is not just possible, but expected. Applause rippled, swelling until it filled the garden. Elena saw tears on faces in the crowd, and then, at the edge of the gathering, she caught sight of Richard Whitmore. He stood with arms crossed, his face carved with anger, their eyes locked across the distance. Richard mouthed the words, "Enjoy this moment. It won't last." Elena lifted her chin. It already has, she thought. The medal was draped around her neck, the cameras flashed, the applause thundered. But for Elena, the true victory had happened hours earlier in a virtual boardroom where grace had outweighed greed. That evening, as she returned to her hotel, Marcus handed her the final tally of investor responses. The board's decision had reassured them. Shares stabilized. Confidence returned. Still, Elena knew Richard would not disappear quietly. But his grip was weakening. His allies were drifting, and the future belonged not to his resentment, but to the vision she carried. For now, though, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She stood at the window, looking over the city lights of Washington. The medal rested against her chest, cool and heavy. Her notebook lay open beside her with a fresh line written across the page. Grace wins slower than power, but it wins deeper. That night, the medal still cool against her skin. Elena Brooks received a phone call that stripped away every ounce of triumph she had felt hours earlier. It was Emma. Her voice trembled. My mother collapsed after the ceremony. They brought her back to hospice. The doctors, they don't think she'll last the night. Elena didn't hesitate. She left the hotel, medal still hanging at her neck, and rode in silence through the streets of Washington toward the hospice. Marcus offered to come, but she shook her head. This is something I need to do alone. When she entered the quiet room, the scent of antiseptic mingled with lavender from a diffuser. Machines hummed faintly, but the monitors showed what Elena already knew: Victoria Whitmore's body was failing. Emma sat at her side, clutching her mother's hand with both of hers. Victoria's eyes fluttered open as Elena stepped closer. The transformation was striking. The imperious woman who had sneered on Flight 312, who had once dripped with entitlement, was now frail. Her features softened not only by illness but by humility. "You came," Victoria whispered. "Yes," Elena said softly, pulling a chair close. For a long moment, there was only the sound of shallow breathing and Emma's muffled sobs. Then Victoria motioned weakly to the nightstand. A manuscript lay there, thick with handwritten notes and edits. Elena picked it up, recognizing the title scrawled across the cover seat to be a reckoning. Victoria's voice was raspy but deliberate. "It's not an apology. It's a dissection of privilege, of blindness, of the thousand small cruelties that led me to that one big public one. Half the proceeds your fellowship, the other half to families I've wronged." Elena turned the pages, her eyes catching on chapter titles: "The Comfortable Blindness," "The Cost of Superiority," "Learning to See." It was raw, vulnerable, nothing like the woman she had once faced down at 30,000 feet. "Why tell me?" Elena asked. "Because I need you to decide if it deserves the light of day." Elena's throat tightened. "That's not my choice." Victoria coughed, each sound rattling her frail body. "It is, because without your name beside it, no one will believe I changed." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Elena nodded. "Then I'll help you publish it." Relief washed over Victoria's face. Her hand trembled as she reached for Elena's. "Thank you for seeing me when I didn't deserve to be seen." Emma leaned forward, tears spilling freely. "Mom, rest now. I'll carry it." Victoria smiled faintly. "You already are." Her eyes drifted toward Elena one final time. "Your grandmother, she cleaned houses like mine, wherever she is. I hope she knows her granddaughter didn't just keep her seat. She changed who gets to sit where." Her hand slackened, the monitors flatlined, and just like that, the woman who had once embodied casual cruelty was gone, leaving behind not triumph, but a strange kind of grace. Emma collapsed into Elena's arms, sobbing into her shoulder. Elena held her, feeling the weight of both grief and transformation. She realized then that redemption didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it came in the quiet of a hospice room, where truth finally broke through the noise. The funeral was small, almost private. Many in society would have chosen to look away from Victoria's end. But Elena stood with Emma, and together they buried a woman who had once humiliated one of them and given life to the other. It was complicated, messy, and profoundly human. Weeks later, Seat to Be a Reckoning was published. Critics called it a devastating self-examination of privilege. Book clubs dissected it. News anchors debated it. Families around the country sat at dinner tables, asking uncomfortable but necessary questions. Sales skyrocketed. But Elena cared little for that. What mattered were the letters that began arriving at her office. A teacher in Detroit wrote, "I read this with my students. We cried, then we talked about our own blind spots." A retired pilot said, "This book forced me to admit the biases I carried into every cockpit." And one letter, written in careful handwriting from a 16-year-old girl in Atlanta, read, "Ms. Brooks, I watched the video of you on the plane. I thought it was just another story on the internet. Then I read Mrs. Whitmore's book. I realized racism doesn't just die when old people do. It's in me, in my school, and my friends. But if she could change, maybe I can too." Elena kept that letter pinned above her desk. Meanwhile, Emma poured herself into flight school, carrying her mother's complicated legacy with quiet determination. Elena watched as the young woman grew into her uniform, her confidence blooming, her passion undeniable. And with each milestone Emma achieved, Elena felt her own decision vindicated not by the critics, but by the simple fact of Emma's resilience. Yet shadows still lingered. Richard Whitmore had not disappeared. He sulked in boardrooms, whispered in investors' ears, plotted in silence. His last gambit, the failed coup, had weakened him, but not destroyed him. Elena knew another confrontation loomed. For now, though, she allowed herself to breathe. One evening, months later, she stood at the window of her Dallas office, watching planes ascend into the fading sky. Marcus entered quietly. "You're still here," he said. "Just watching," Elena murmured. "What do you see?" She smiled faintly. "Possibility." Her phone buzzed then. A message from Emma. "I passed my final exam. Captain's wings next." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The daughter of the woman who had once taken her seat was now earning her own. Not by entitlement, but by effort. It was the full circle she hadn't dared hope for. The revolution that had begun at 30,000 feet had not ended with a viral video or even a medal. It had landed here in the transformation of lives, in the ripple of conversations across boardrooms and classrooms, in the grace that turned an enemy's daughter into an ally. And for Elena, that was the truest legacy of all. Richard Whitmore was a man who didn't know how to lose quietly. In the months following the Medal of Freedom ceremony, Elena Brooks carried her company forward with measured grace. Employee satisfaction rose, passenger complaints dropped, and GlobalAir's reputation soared. But in the shadow of every success, Richard lurked, gnawing at his dwindling power like a man unwilling to accept history had passed him by. He had once been the untouchable lion of the boardroom, a man whose name commanded deference. Now, he was reduced to whispered strategy sessions in dim hotel lounges. Phone calls to investors who listened politely but no longer committed, and dinners where he raged about Elena's cult of dignity. "She's turning this airline into a morality play." Richard fumed to Jensen, an old ally. "Airlines aren't built on grace. They're built on numbers, on control, on fear." But Jensen only sighed. "The numbers say she's winning. Richard, and fear. People are tired of it. They want leaders who see them as human." Richard's face darkened. "Then maybe it's time to remind them humans make mistakes." Even Elena Brooks. The plan began small, a leak here, a rumor there. He paid a disgruntled ex-employee to whisper about favoritism. Funded anonymous blogs accusing Elena of self-promotion, and even seeded doubt in investor newsletters. Is grace just another word for weakness? At first, it seemed to work. Stock prices dipped a fraction. Social media buzzed with criticism. Old wounds reopened. But Elena, steady as always, faced the storm with calm. At a press conference, she looked into cameras and said simply, "Criticism doesn't weaken us. Pretending we don't deserve it does. We'll listen, We'll learn, and we'll keep flying." The clip went viral not as scandal, but as reassurance. Within a week, the stock rebounded. Richard seethed. Then came the metal backlash. A fringe group began protesting outside GlobalAir offices, carrying signs that read, "Grace is weakness and keep politics off planes." Richard saw his chance. He quietly funneled money to amplify their voices, turning a fringe protest into national headlines. Marcus brought the report to Elena one morning. "He's funding them. We can trace the money, offshore accounts, but it's his." Elena sighed, closing the file. "If we expose him, he'll call it a witch hunt. If we ignore him, he'll keep festering." "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. "We keep building. Let him dig his own grave." But Richard wasn't done. His final gambit came with a carefully orchestrated trap. GlobalAir was preparing for its largest annual shareholders summit in New York. Elena was scheduled to deliver the keynote, a speech highlighting 5 years of transformation. Richard planned to hijack it. Through back channels, he arranged for an anonymous leak of falsified documents suggesting the fellowship fund had been used to line Elena's personal accounts. He timed it to break hours before the summit, betting that even unproven allegations would erode trust. The morning of the summit, Marcus stormed into Elena's suite, face pale. "It's everywhere. They're saying you embezzled funds." Elena read the headlines on his tablet, CEO's Grace or Greed. Brooks under fire for fellowship scandal. She closed her eyes, steadying herself. "It's false. Of course it's false," Marcus said. "But perception matters. If you walk on that stage, half the room will already think you're guilty." Elena looked out the window at the skyline. She thought of her grandmother, of Victoria in that hospice bed, of Emma with her wings pinned to her jacket. "Then I'll walk on that stage anyway," she said quietly, "because if I don't, he wins without ever proving a thing." The ballroom was packed. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters waiting for blood. Shareholders buzzed with unease, their murmurs rippling like static. And at a table near the front, Richard Whitmore sat with a smirk carved deep into his face. Elena stepped onto the stage. She didn't smile. She didn't deflect. She went straight to the heart. "You've seen the headlines," she began, her voice clear. "Accusations that the Fellowship Fund has been misused, that I, personally, enriched myself under the guise of grace. Let me tell you the truth before rumor hardens into myth." She held up a folder. "These are the financial records of the Fellowship. Every dollar accounted for, every contribution matched by my personal funds, audited independently, available to every shareholder here today." She placed the folder on the podium and leaned closer. "But this isn't just about numbers. It's about trust. Richard Whitmore wants you to believe grace is a mask for weakness, that dignity is a distraction from profit. He is wrong. Dignity is not the opposite of profit. It is the foundation of it. We grew because passengers trusted us, because employees believed in us, because we didn't just fly planes, we lifted people." The room was silent. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering. Elena continued, "If you think grace is weakness, you are free to sell your shares. If you think dignity has no place in business, you're free to invest elsewhere. But as long as I lead this company, we will prove that treating people as human is not a liability. It is our greatest strength. For a moment, nothing. Then a single clap. Then another. Then the room erupted into applause so loud it rattled the chandeliers. Reporters rushed to capture the moment. Headlines flipped within hours. Brooks turns accusation into defining moment. Investors rallied. The scandal dissolved as quickly as it had flared. Richard left the ballroom unnoticed, his allies slipping away from him like sand through fingers. The coup that was supposed to be his resurrection had become his epitaph. That night, alone in his penthouse, Richard poured himself a drink and stared out at the city he once thought he owned. For the first time, he understood the world had changed, and he had not. Meanwhile, Elena sat with Marcus in her office, exhaustion in her bones but fire in her eyes. "He won't stop," Marcus said. "No," Elena admitted, "but neither will we." She glanced at her grandmother's pendant, gleaming softly in the lamplight. She thought of Emma preparing for her first official flight, of passengers boarding planes with renewed trust, of letters from strangers who saw themselves in her story. Richard's last gambit had failed. Grace, once again, had held. And Elena knew the real revolution wasn't in defeating him. It was in building something he could never destroy. 6 months after the shareholders' summit, the air outside Gate 57 at JFK carried the familiar mixture of jet fuel, coffee, and anticipation. Elena Brooks stood quietly at the window. The polished floors reflecting the curve of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner parked on the tarmac. The airline's newest aircraft gleamed in the morning sun, its livery painted with the words "Dignity in Flight." She wasn't here for a ribbon cutting or a press event. This moment was far more personal. Behind her, Marcus adjusted his tie, holding 2 boarding passes. "Are you ready?" he asked. Elena gave him a faint smile. "This time, I'm not the one flying. I'm here to watch." The boarding gate announced the start of first-class seating. Passengers lined up, some whispering excitedly as they recognized Elena, others oblivious, focused on their phones. And then, striding confidently in her crisp captain's uniform, came Emma Whitmore. Emma's cap sat perfectly, her wings gleaming against her jacket. She carried herself not with entitlement, but with a quiet pride that came from years of study, exams, and relentless training. When she saw Elena, her face softened into a smile. "You made it," Emma said, her voice carrying both relief and joy. "I wouldn't miss it," Elena replied. "Today is bigger than any medal. This is the day you claim your own seat." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the granddaughter of a cleaning woman and the daughter of a woman who had once tried to strip away dignity at 30,000 feet, now bound not by animosity but by grace, standing side by side at the edge of a runway that symbolized the future. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, today marks the inaugural international flight captained by Emma Whitmore, the youngest woman in GlobalAir history to achieve this rank. Please join us in wishing her safe travels." Applause broke out across the gate area. Emma blushed slightly, nodding to the crowd. Elena's chest swelled with pride, not the possessive pride of ownership, but the liberating pride of witnessing transformation. As Emma boarded with her crew, Marcus leaned close. "You know, this is going to be in every newspaper tomorrow. Enemy's daughter becomes Airline's future." Elena chuckled. "Let them write it. People need to see Grace can change bloodlines." She stayed at the gate until the plane began taxiing, its engines roaring with promise. She watched it lift into the sky, a streak of white against blue, carrying with it not just passengers but a symbol that legacies can be rewritten. Later that evening, back in her office, Elena sifted through letters that had become a daily ritual. One caught her eye, handwritten on lined paper, neat and careful. "Miss Brooks, I got my wings today. Thank you for keeping your seat so I could earn mine." It was signed by an indigenous student from Alaska, one of the latest fellowship recipients. Elena placed it beside the letter she had kept from the Detroit teacher. Together, they formed a mosaic of voices, proof that what had begun as humiliation on a plane had grown into a movement reshaping lives. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore faded into obscurity. His name still appeared occasionally in financial circles, but each time with diminishing relevance. He sold off his remaining shares quietly, his once feared presence reduced to footnotes in board minutes. The last anyone heard, he had retired to a coastal town, bitter and isolated. Elena rarely thought of him now. He had chosen to fight the future and had been left behind. What mattered more were the stories emerging from within GlobalAir itself. A ground crew worker in Atlanta wrote about how new training programs helped him confront his own biases. A flight attendant in Seattle described how the whistleblower policy gave her courage to speak up against harassment. Even passengers noticed a mother wrote in to thank the airline for how her autistic son was treated with patience and respect during a delay. These weren't headline-grabbing victories, but Elena cherished them more than the front-page features. Change, she had learned, wasn't measured in viral clips or even medals. It was measured in the quiet, consistent dignity of everyday interactions. One night, as she walked through the nearly empty Dallas headquarters, Elena paused at the lobby wall where the company's new slogan had been etched. "Every seat deserves respect." She ran her hand lightly over the letters, remembering the night she had sat alone at her grandmother's grave, asking how to balance justice and mercy. She could almost hear the whisper again. Grace isn't weakness. It's strength refusing to be poisoned by resentment. Elena smiled, the weight in her chest both heavy and freeing. Months later, she attended the premiere of Zoe Kim's documentary, Keep Your Seat, now expanded into a full-length feature. The theater was packed with students, activists, business leaders, and ordinary travelers. On screen, the story unfolded shaky cell phone footage of a confrontation on a plane, interviews with employees, Emma's journey through flight school, Victoria's final words in hospice. When the lights came up, the audience sat in reverent silence before erupting into applause. Elena found herself holding Emma's hand. "You realize," Emma whispered, "this is bigger than both of us now." Elena nodded. It was never just about us. It was about everyone who's ever been told they don't belong in a seat they earned. The following week, Elena spoke at a university lecture hall, her words simple but resonant. The revolution doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in daily choices, in the moments we decide to see each other as human, in the courage to keep your seat and to make room for others. Students lined up afterward to thank her, many in tears. A young man said, "My parents were told they didn't belong here. Hearing you, I know I do." And so the movement continued not with fanfare, but with the steady ripple of changed lives. 5 years later, Elena returned to JFK. Gate 57 looked the same, though the signage now bore the airline's updated brand bold, inclusive, unapologetically human. She stood there as another flight boarded, passengers shuffling past with luggage and lattes. But this time, she wasn't alone. Emma stood beside her in full captain's uniform, preparing to fly her first transatlantic route as captain. The same gate where her mother had once humiliated Elena had now become the threshold of her own triumph. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, her voice steady but warm. Emma smiled, her eyes glistening. "Your grandmother's granddaughter asking my mother's daughter if she's ready. The world really has changed, hasn't it?" Elena shook her head gently. "No, we changed it one seat at a time." As Emma walked down the jet bridge toward her plane, Elena stayed behind, watching the tide of passengers. She thought of her grandmother, of Victoria, of Richard, of every name and face that had shaped this journey. And as the plane lifted into the sky, Elena whispered to herself, "Dignity is no longer negotiable. Grace is no longer optional. And change, real change, is no longer impossible." The revolution that began at 30,000 feet had landed not in victory or defeat, but in something more enduring, a world where keeping your seat meant making space for others, and where grace had proven to be the most revolutionary act of all. The years slipped by quietly, though Elena Brooks had long ago stopped measuring her life in quarters and profits. She measured it now in stories, letters, conversations, and faces glimpsed in passing that told her the world had shifted, even if only slightly. GlobalAir thrived beyond even her cautious optimism. It wasn't just an airline anymore, it was a case study in business schools, a symbol debated in ethics classes, a point of reference for leaders trying to reconcile profit with principle. The Brooks model, they called it. She never cared for the title, but she cared for the results: employees who walked taller, passengers who felt seen, and young leaders who believed grace could sit beside power without apology. Her hair had silvered, her stride slowed, but her presence carried the same quiet gravity. When Elena entered a room, people still paused, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied something rare in corporate life: consistency. She had not bent, not once, even when bending might have been easier. On her last official day as CEO, the board gathered in the same Dallas headquarters where she had once fought Richard Whitmore for survival. This time, there were no smirks, no whispered doubts, only respect. Marcus stood beside her, older too, his loyalty etched in laugh lines and the calm weight of years. "Elena," Margaret Thompson said, rising to speak, "you changed more than this company. You changed us. You showed us that leadership isn't about avoiding storms, it's about steering through them with integrity." Elena smiled faintly. I didn't do it alone. None of this was ever about one seat. It was about every seat." They applauded as she stepped down, her pendant catching the light one final time in the boardroom. She handed the reins to a successor, chosen not for politics but for principle, a former flight attendant turned executive, who had lived the journey from aisle to office. In retirement, Elena didn't vanish. She lectured at universities, wrote essays about dignity in business, and sat on nonprofit boards. But she spent most of her time at airports, not in VIP lounges or private jets, but in the terminals watching, listening, remembering. It was at JFK, her old crucible, where she found herself one autumn morning, sipping coffee near Gate 57. Emma Whitmore was there too, now a seasoned captain with thousands of hours in the logbook. The once nervous young woman carried herself with the easy confidence of someone who had earned every stripe. They walked together along the concourse, past families juggling strollers, students clutching backpacks, and business travelers lost in their screens. "Do you ever miss it?" Emma asked. The title, "No," Elena replied. "The responsibility sometimes, but the work doesn't stop just because the office changes." Emma nodded. "You know, there are cadets now, young women, young men who say they joined because of you, because of that day. They call it the 30,000-foot revolution." Elena chuckled softly. "It wasn't a revolution. It was a refusal. I refused to give up my seat. That's all. But that refusal became a door," Emma said gently. "For me, for so many others." They stopped at a window overlooking the tarmac. A GlobalAir jet was pushing back, its engines humming, on the fuselage, in bold lettering. The airline's motto still shone, "Every seat deserves respect." Elena felt her throat tighten. That's what matters. Not medals, not boardroom victories. This, seeing people step onto a plane believing they belong. Later that evening, Elena attended a dinner at the university where Zoe Kim's documentary was now part of the curriculum. Students lined up to thank her, some in tears, others trembling with the weight of what her story had meant to them. One young man, shy and soft-spoken, said, "My mother was a cleaner. She always told me to keep my head down, but your grandmother, and you made me believe I could lift mine." Elena squeezed his hand. "Then carry that belief forward. Grace isn't something you receive once. It's something you practice every day." The next morning, alone in her study, Elena opened a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were artifacts of the journey, the original boarding pass from that fateful flight, yellowed at the edges, the medal of freedom, still gleaming, Victoria Whitmore's manuscript, worn from countless readings, and the letters from strangers who had been changed by her stand. She reread one, "Grace is harder than grudges. That's why it matters more." She smiled through tears. Out of the mouths of children, she whispered, recalling the boardroom that had once hung in balance on those very words. Not long after, Elena received an invitation she hadn't expected to attend Emma's inaugural transoceanic flight as chief captain. She accepted without hesitation. The day came bright and clear. Elena boarded the plane, slipping quietly into her seat in first class, not as CEO, not as a symbol, but as a passenger. She watched as Emma strode down the aisle, greeted her crew, and spoke with passengers. When Emma reached her, their eyes met. "Ready?" Elena asked. Emma grinned. "Always?" As the plane lifted into the sky, Elena closed her eyes, listening to the engine's steady roar. She thought of her grandmother's whisper at the cemetery, of Victoria's fragile confession, of Richard's defeated scowl, of Marcus's steady hand on her shoulder. She thought of every insult, every headline, every clap of unexpected applause. And she thought of Grace, how it had carried her higher than anger ever could. Hours later, as the plane descended over London, Elena felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She realized the revolution hadn't ended, because revolutions of the heart never do. They ripple, they echo, they seed themselves in places unseen until one day the world looks different. When the plane landed and the applause filled the cabin for Emma, Elena joined in, her hands clapping until they stung. She wasn't applauding just for Emma. She was applauding for every unseen grandmother, every silenced passenger, every voice that had once been told, "You don't belong here." Years later, when Elena's time finally came, her memorial was held in the very rose garden where she had once received the Medal of Freedom. Former presidents attended, as did students, employees, passengers, and strangers whose lives had been touched by her story. Emma spoke last, her voice strong, her uniform immaculate. She taught me that keeping your seat isn't about pride. It's about dignity. It's about making room for others, even when the world tells you not to. She taught me that grace is the most revolutionary act of all, and because of her, the sky belongs to all of us. The crowd rose, a standing ovation for a woman who had never sought applause but had earned it nonetheless. And somewhere, Elena's grandmother's spirit smiled. The granddaughter who had once been invisible had changed not just who sat in seat 1C, but who belonged in every seat on every plane, in every room, in every space where dignity had once been denied. The revolution at 30,000 feet had landed, and its legacy would never leave the ground again. Elena Brooks's passing did not mark the end of her story. In some ways, it was only the beginning. Weeks after her memorial in the Rose Garden, Zoe Kim's team released a special documentary segment that had been filmed in the final years of Elena's life. The footage showed her sitting in a simple armchair, wearing no jewelry except her grandmother's pendant. Speaking quietly into the camera. "Grace," she said, "isn't just a word for forgiveness. It's a practice of resistance, a refusal to let resentment dictate the future. If all I did was keep my seat, that would have been survival. But helping others claim theirs, that's legacy." Clips of this interview spread quickly, shared across social media with captions like, "This is the kind of leadership we need." Young activists quoted her in marches. CEOs quoted her in keynotes, and families repeated her words around dinner tables. But it wasn't only America that listened. In Johannesburg, a group of South African pilots started the Brooks Initiative, a scholarship program for women entering aviation. In Mumbai, an airline cited Elena's model when it overhauled its passenger service policies. In São Paulo, a union used her words to argue for dignity and workplace reforms. Marcus Reed, now semi-retired, traveled often to speak about her leadership. At one event, a student asked him, What was Elena's secret? He thought for a long moment before answering. Her secret was simple. She believed people could change, even when they didn't believe it themselves, and she never confused power with dignity. Emma Whitmore carried that legacy most visibly. As chief captain, she often found herself recognized not for her own skill, but for being the daughter of Victoria or the protégée of Elena. At first, it stung. But over time, she leaned into it, determined to show that her story was not defined by her mother's shame but by her own choices. On one flight from Paris to New York, turbulence forced her to divert to Boston. A passenger grew angry, shouting at a flight attendant. Emma left the cockpit briefly, standing before the man. "Sir," she said firmly but calmly, "this airline was built on dignity. If you can't treat my crew with respect, you don't belong on this plane." The cabin fell silent. The man sputtered, then sat down, chastened. Passengers later said it felt like witnessing Elena all over again. After landing, Emma received hundreds of messages of thanks, many invoking Elena's name. She smiled, but she also felt something deeper, that she had carried the torch forward in her own way. At GlobalAir headquarters, the culture Elena had seeded continued to evolve. The whistleblower program became a model adopted across industries. The fellowship expanded to 200 students a year, producing engineers, pilots, mechanics, and executives who infused the industry with new voices. One young fellow, a refugee from Syria, stood on stage at a conference and declared, "I never thought I'd belong in aviation. But Elena Brooks made me believe I could sit anywhere. Now, I'm building planes, not just riding them." Stories like his rippled outward, reshaping not just an airline but an entire sector. Richard Whitmore's name, meanwhile, faded almost entirely. Investors rarely mentioned him, and when they did, it was as a cautionary tale the man who tried to weaponize resentment and lost everything. He spent his final years by the sea, railing occasionally in obscure blogs no one read, a relic of a world unwilling to adapt. When he died, the news barely made a footnote. By contrast, the 5th anniversary of Elena's Medal of Freedom sparked a global day of recognition. Airports across the world lit up their runways in her honor. At JFK, Gate 57 was officially renamed the Brooks Gate, with a plaque reading, "She kept her seat, so we could keep ours." Emma attended the dedication, standing where her mother had once sneered, where Elena had once been humiliated, and where the world had turned upside down. Reporters crowded, microphones thrust forward. "What does this mean to you?" one asked. Emma paused, looking at the plaque. "It means that one person's grace can ripple far beyond their lifetime. My mother's cruelty started this story, but Elena's dignity finished it, and now it belongs to all of us." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "She taught me that grace isn't soft. It's steel wrapped in compassion. It bends the arc of history not by force, but by persistence." The crowd applauded, and Emma felt tears sting her eyes. That evening, as she prepared for her next flight, a young cadet approached her. "Captain Whitmore," he said shyly, "I'm one of the new fellows. I just wanted to say, if you hadn't been given your chance, I wouldn't be here." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then honor it." fly with dignity. That's how we keep the revolution alive. Later, alone in her hotel room, Emma pulled out a notebook Elena had once given her. Inside the cover was a line written in Elena's careful script: "Grace wins slower than power, but it wins deeper." Emma traced the words with her finger, whispering, "And it keeps winning." The revolution that had begun at 30,000 feet now lived on in every flight where a passenger felt respected, every employee who found courage to speak, every student who dared to apply for a seat once denied to them. It lived in Emma's steady hands on the yoke, in Marcus's lectures, in Zoe Kim's documentaries, in the fellowship recipients scattered across the world. And it lived in the unseen moments, the grandmother boarding a plane without fear, the child peering out a window dreaming of being a pilot, the worker who chose compassion over contempt because he remembered Elena's story. Grace had become not just Elena Brooks's legacy, but the industry's compass. And though she was gone, her voice still lingered in interviews, in writings, in the hearts of those she touched. A whisper carried across terminals and tarmacs, across oceans and skies. Everyone deserves a seat, and keeping yours while making room for others is the most revolutionary act of all. By the time the 10th anniversary of Flight 312 arrived, Elena Brooks' story had transcended aviation. It had become part of the broader American narrative, a parable about power, prejudice, and persistence that people invoked in classrooms, political speeches, and even family conversations at dinner tables. The White House announced a national initiative called the GRACE Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation requiring all federally regulated industries, aviation, banking, healthcare to establish dignity and bias interruption protocols modeled after Elena's reforms. The act sailed through Congress with unusual speed. Senators who had rarely agreed on anything found themselves quoting Elena's words, "Grace wins slower than power, but it wins deeper." Meanwhile, universities across the country added her case to leadership curricula. Harvard Business School called it the Brooks Paradigm. Students at community colleges studied her alongside Rosa Parks and Nelson Mandela, and high schools across the Midwest used Zoe Kim's documentary as part of civics classes, teaching young people that dignity wasn't an abstract concept but a daily practice. Marcus Reed, older now and carrying a cane, testified before Congress about the act. His voice shook, but his words carried weight. Elena believed dignity wasn't charity, it was obligation. If we forget that, we're not just failing her legacy, we're failing ourselves. The chamber erupted in applause. Emma Whitmore, now one of the most respected captains in aviation, carried that legacy in more tangible ways. She established a mentorship network for young women of color pursuing aviation careers, pairing each cadet with a seasoned pilot. She named it the Brooks Fellowship Network. The slogan, printed on every piece of material, read, "Every seat deserves respect." At a graduation ceremony for new fellows, Emma addressed the crowd. "This program isn't about me. It isn't even about Elena anymore. It's about you. Each of you is proof that the revolution didn't end in a viral video. It lives every time you take your seat in the cockpit or the boardroom without apology." The applause shook the hall, and Emma felt a lump in her throat. She remembered her mother's shame, Elena's forgiveness, and her own uncertain beginnings. Now, She was part of something bigger than herself, a living chain of transformation. The cultural impact spread even further. Major airlines around the world adopted policies inspired by GlobalAir. Public buses in Chicago displayed a campaign poster showing Elena's face with the caption, "Keep your seat, keep your dignity." Streaming services released dramatizations of her story. One series, based loosely on her life, broke records for viewership, sparking debates across dinner tables and social platforms. Not all responses were celebratory. Critics argued that the story had been commodified, turned into slogans and merchandise. But even those critiques kept the conversation alive, forcing society to reckon with what dignity truly meant in practice. And in living rooms across America, ordinary people debated their own blind spots. Parents admitted biases to their children. Teachers rethought how they disciplined students. Clerks at grocery stores reminded each other to pause before making assumptions. Small shifts, invisible at scale, but powerful in accumulation. One evening, Zoe Kim visited Emma at her apartment in Queens. She carried with her a new film project, a follow-up to her original documentary. "This one's not about Elena directly," Zoe explained, setting her camera bag on the table. "It's about what came after, how the revolution at 30,000 feet kept moving once it landed." Emma smiled. "Then you're telling my story too." "Yes," Zoe said. "Yours, Marcus's, the fellows, even the passengers who wrote letters. They filmed for months, capturing Emma in the cockpit, Marcus in hearings, fellows in classrooms. They even tracked down the woman who had filmed the original confrontation on Flight 312 with her phone, now a professor of media studies. She told her students, 'I didn't know I was filming history. I just knew something was wrong, and I couldn't stay silent.' The film premiered at Sundance, just as Zoe's first had years earlier. Audiences wept, applauded, and debated. One critic wrote, 'This isn't just about an airline. It's about who we decide gets to sit where in schools, in offices, in politics, in life.' By then, Emma had become something she never expected, a public figure. Invitations poured in for her to speak at conferences and universities. She hesitated at first, preferring the solitude of the cockpit, but she accepted, remembering Elena's advice. When you're given a seat, you don't sit quietly, you use it. At one keynote in Atlanta, standing on the very stage where her mother had once humiliated Elena at a gala. Emma addressed thousands. "My mother once took a seat that didn't belong to her. Elena didn't just take it back, she built a table where everyone belonged. That's the work I continue. That's the work we must all continue." The audience rose in thunderous applause. Emma blinked back tears, her voice breaking slightly as she added, "This isn't just about aviation. It's about America. Who gets to sit? Who gets to speak? Who gets to belong?" Elena answered with her life. Now it's our turn. In that moment, the circle closed. The shame of her mother's past had been transfigured into a beacon for others. Years later, when Emma herself prepared for retirement, she returned to Dallas headquarters. A new generation led GlobalAir by then, but the culture still bore Elena's imprint. In the lobby stood a bronze statue not of Elena alone, but of two women side by side. One, elegant and composed, clutching a boarding pass. The other, younger, in a captain's uniform, her hand resting lightly on the other's shoulder. The plaque read, "Dignity is not inherited. It is chosen every day." Emma stood before it, tears streaking her face. She whispered, "We carried it. Elena, we carried it as far as we could." The world outside still struggled. Of course, racism had not vanished. Inequity still marked countless lives. But the revolution at 30,000 feet had carved a permanent space in the world's imagination. It had seeded a truth too stubborn to die that grace, practiced stubbornly, could bend systems, not just hearts. And though Emma's voice grew hoarse with age, she repeated Elena's mantra to every cadet, every student, every audience she met. Everyone deserves a seat. Keep yours, make room for others. That's how the world changes. The sun poured golden light across Dallas-Fort Worth International, painting the runways in long shadows. A new day of departures had begun, and in the atrium of GlobalAir's headquarters, a crowd gathered for the annual Brooks Fellowship induction. Rows of young faces filled the seats: cadets, engineers, law students, future leaders. They were the latest recipients of a fellowship that had grown from 50 awards to more than 500 each year. Funded by GlobalAir and by donations inspired by Elena Brooks's legacy. At the front sat Emma Whitmore, now gray at the temples but steady as ever. Her captain's uniform gleamed with medals earned over decades of service. She leaned on a polished cane but held herself tall, her presence commanding without effort. Zoe Kim's camera crew was there too, filming what would become her third documentary in the series. This time, though, the spotlight wasn't on Elena or Emma. It was on the students, the ones carrying the story into the next century. The keynote speaker stepped up Jordan Alvarez, a 22-year-old aeronautical engineering prodigy from Albuquerque. Jordan had grown up hearing about Elena's fight and Emma's resilience. His acceptance essay had moved the committee to tears. "When someone tells me I don't belong in the cockpit, I remember Elena kept her seat so I could take mine." The applause thundered as Jordan adjusted the microphone. "I never met Elena Brooks, but I live in the world she shaped. A world where someone like me, brown-skinned, raised by a single mother, cleaning hotel rooms can stand here not as an exception, but as proof of what's possible." She turned an insult into a revolution. And now, it's our job to keep flying higher. The fellows rose in ovation. Emma felt her chest tighten, pride swelling like wings inside her ribs. Later that evening, Emma wandered the hallways of GlobalAir headquarters. The walls were lined with photographs Elena shaking hands with world leaders, addressing Congress, smiling beside cadets. Each frame told a piece of the larger story. She paused before one image she'd seen countless times: Elena standing on the tarmac, wind whipping her hair, her hand raised as if inviting the world to board. Beneath the photo was Elena's handwriting, preserved in brass. "Grace isn't weakness. Grace is power refusing to be poisoned by resentment." Emma touched the plaque lightly. "I hope we've done you proud," she whispered. Outside, the runways gleamed with activity. A new GlobalAir A350 stood ready, its fuselage painted with the fellowship emblem. On its side, bold letters read, "The Elena Brooks Legacy Flight." That evening's flight would be special. A ceremonial journey carrying fellows, mentors, and dignitaries from Dallas to Washington. D.C. on board. They would honor Elena's memory with stories, laughter, and a recommitment to the values she had lived. Emma boarded last. As she stepped into the cabin, she paused at the threshold of first class. For a moment, it felt like stepping back into time, back to that day when her mother had stolen a seat, back to the humiliation, back to the silence before the storm. She walked slowly down the aisle, past the luxurious seats, until she reached 1C. It was empty, reserved for her. She placed her hand on the armrest, then lowered herself carefully into the seat. The cabin fell silent. Dozens of fellows watched, understanding without words the gravity of the moment. Emma looked at them, her voice breaking slightly. This was the seat where it all began. My mother sat here when she shouldn't have. Elena gave it back not just to herself, but to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Tonight, I sit here to remind us that every seat we take must open another for someone else. That's how we honor her. Tears glistened in the eyes of the fellows. Some lifted their phones to record, knowing this moment would echo across their generation. The engines roared to life. As the plane ascended, the cabin lights dimmed, and Emma closed her eyes. She thought of her mother, flawed, blind, but redeemed in the end. She thought of Elena, unyielding, graceful, forever present. And she thought of herself not as a daughter defined by shame, but as a woman who had carried a torch through storm and sky. Midway through the flight, Zoe approached her. "Emma, can I ask you something on camera?" Emma nodded. Zoe steadied the lens. "What do you think Elena would say if she were here tonight?" Emma smiled faintly. "She'd probably tell me not to cry. She'd tell these fellows not to just take seats, but to build tables. And she'd tell all of us that the revolution was never about airlines. It was about seeing each other as human, every day, in every space." The fellows applauded softly, some whispering, "Amen." When the plane landed in D.C., dawn was breaking. The city glowed in soft pink light as the passengers disembarked. On the tarmac, a crowd of reporters and students waited, waving signs that read, "Keep your seat, share your seat." Emma stepped down slowly, cane in hand, greeted by the cheers of young people who had grown up under Elena's shadow. They pressed forward, asking for advice, blessings, selfies. She laughed softly, telling them, "Don't look at me. Look at each other. That's where the future is." That night, back in her hotel, Emma sat by the window, looking out at the city where Elena had once received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Her body was tired, her bones aching, but her spirit was alight. On the table beside her sat a letter. She had received it earlier that day from a 12-year-old girl in Detroit, a future pilot who had just been accepted into a youth aviation program. The girl had written Miss Whitmore, "I wasn't born when Flight 312 happened, but I know the story, and when people tell me flying isn't for girls like me, I tell them, Elena Brooks kept her seat so one day I could take mine. Thank you for carrying her story. Someday, I'll carry it too." Emma held the letter against her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. She whispered into the quiet, "The revolution continues." As she drifted to sleep, her dreams were filled with the sound of engines, the sight of open skies, and the certainty that dignity once claimed could never again be surrendered. It began quietly, almost like turbulence before a storm. A university in Johannesburg invited Emma Whitmore to deliver a lecture on aviation equity. Then came an invitation from Sao Paulo, followed by Tokyo, London, and New Delhi. Soon, the phrase "keep your seat" wasn't just an American slogan, it became a universal call for dignity in travel, in education, in life. Emma, despite her age and the strain of travel, accepted as many invitations as she could. With her cane in hand and her voice steady, she stood before audiences who spoke dozens of languages but recognized the same truth. In South Africa, she told students your country knows what it means to fight for a seat, to demand humanity. Elena's lesson wasn't confined to America. It belongs here too, in every place where someone is told they don't belong. In Japan, a shy student approached her after a speech. "My grandmother was told women shouldn't fly." The student whispered, "Now I'm in pilot training. Because of you." Because of Elena. Emma smiled, placing a hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "No, because of you. You kept your seat." The movement grew beyond aviation. Human rights activists in Brazil adapted the phrase to fight for housing rights. "Keep your home." Teachers in India used it to argue for equal classroom opportunities. "Keep your desk." Even tech companies in Europe launched campaigns to ensure inclusive hiring, framing it as "keep your place at the table," everywhere. Elena's story became a mirror people held up to their own struggles. Zoe Kim, ever with her camera, captured these ripples in a sprawling documentary called "The World Takes Its Seat." The film followed Emma across continents, showing how one woman's refusal to move on a single flight had seeded revolutions in countless contexts. In Nairobi, Zoe filmed a round table of young African women engineers. One of them said, "We watched the video of Flight 312 in high school. When the woman said, 'This seat isn't for you,' it was like she was speaking to all of us. And when Elena fought back, she was fighting for us too." The world premiere of the documentary in Geneva drew diplomats, activists, and CEOs. During the panel discussion, a journalist asked Emma, "Do you think Elena imagined her story would travel this far?" Emma paused, her eyes glistening. No, Elena wasn't trying to start a movement. She was just trying to sit in the seat she'd paid for. The world turned that act into something bigger. Maybe that's the point. Revolutions don't begin with speeches. They begin when someone quietly refuses to surrender. Applause filled the hall, echoing like a promise. But the global spread wasn't without resistance. Some critics dismissed the movement as performative. Politicians in Europe accused it of being American moral imperialism. A viral op-ed argued grace is a luxury for those with power. For the rest of us, survival demands confrontation, not forgiveness. Emma read those words on a long flight back to New York. They gnawed at her. Was it true? Was grace naive outside certain contexts? She wrestled with the thought for hours, staring at the night sky beyond her window. When the plane landed, she called Marcus Reed, now retired but still sharp as ever. "Marcus," she said, her voice low, "what if grace doesn't work everywhere?" Marcus chuckled softly on the line. "Grace isn't a tactic, Emma. It's a truth. Sometimes it wins quietly. Sometimes it takes longer. But it always matters. even when it looks like it doesn't. Emma exhaled, tension easing from her chest. Back in Dallas, the GlobalAir board voted to expand the fellowship internationally. They announced new chapters in Africa, Asia, and South America. The first cohort of international fellows gathered in Washington, D.C., the following year. One of them, a young Syrian refugee named Layla, stunned the room with her story. I lost my home, my country, my family, but I didn't lose my dream to fly. When I read about Elena Brooks, I realized dignity isn't given, it's claimed. Tonight, I claim mine. Her words brought the room to tears. Emma hugged her tightly afterward. Elena would be proud of you, she whispered. The international fellows carried the torch further. Layla went on to become the first Syrian woman to captain a commercial jet in Europe. A Brazilian mechanic named Rafael, also a fellow, designed fuel systems that reduced emissions by 30%. A Kenyan lawyer named Amina used her fellowship platform to argue cases for women's workplace rights. Each carried Elena's story into new battles, reshaping industries far beyond aviation. Meanwhile, Clara Whitmore's name faded into history. The world remembered her only as a footnote, the woman who had triggered the revolution by claiming a seat she didn't own. Her daughter Emma bore that weight, but had long since transformed it. One evening, after a long tour, Emma sat at her desk in Queens. Letters piled high from around the globe, students, workers, activists, all thanking her for keeping the legacy alive. She picked one at random, from a teacher in Ghana. It read, "I tell my students that Elena Brooks isn't just an American hero. She belongs to all of us. She taught us that the seat you fight for isn't just yours. It's everyone's who comes after you." Emma pressed the letter to her heart. She whispered into the quiet, "Yes, that's it. That's what she meant all along." As age weighed heavier on her bones, Emma knew her time in the cockpit was nearly done. But she also knew the skies were fuller than ever, with voices, faces, and dreams that once would have been turned away at the gate. The revolution had crossed oceans, and with each new seat claimed, the world grew closer to the one Elena had imagined, where dignity wasn't optional, and grace wasn't rare. Winter pressed gently against the windows of Emma Whitmore's apartment in Queens. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, blurring the skyline beyond. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, but inside her living room all was still. Emma sat in her armchair, wrapped in a wool blanket, a cup of chamomile tea warming her palms. Her cane leaned nearby, and on the table lay a stack of letters. Some were typed, some written by hand, others decorated with stickers from children. They all carried the same theme: gratitude, hope, and the acknowledgement of a legacy larger than one life. She read one aloud, her voice quiet but firm. "Dear Captain Whitmore, I saw your story on the fellowship website. My dad says people like us don't make it far, but you did. Elena did. So maybe I can too. Love, Daniel, age 13. Emma smiled. The letters reminded her that the work wasn't finished, that every generation needed reminding of their worth. That week, the GlobalAir Foundation had arranged for her to meet a group of young fellows at the company's training center in Dallas. Doctors had urged her to rest, But Emma insisted on traveling. "I'm not done yet," she told Zoe Kim, who had come by to check on her. Zoe shook her head with affectionate exasperation. "You're 76. Emma, you've done enough for 3 lifetimes." Emma's eyes twinkled. "Then I can manage one more." When she arrived in Dallas, the fellows gathered in a bright auditorium, their faces eager, their notebooks open. Emma walked slowly to the stage, her cane clicking softly against the floor. The room rose in a standing ovation before she even spoke. She raised a hand for quiet. "Sit down, children. If you stand too long, you'll forget how to stay grounded." Laughter rippled through the room. Then her voice softened. "I'm here to tell you a story. Not mine. Elena's. The one you've heard 100 times. The day she was told a seat wasn't hers. The day she refused to move. The day the world shifted. The fellows listened, though they already knew every detail. But Emma told it differently now. Not as history, but as inheritance. What you carry isn't a tale for textbooks. It's a compass. It's what you'll use when someone questions whether you belong, when the system tells you no, when your own heart whispers doubt. That's when you'll remember Elena." Her voice grew stronger. "But don't just keep your seat. Build more, for others, for the ones still invisible. That's how you honor her." Applause thundered, echoing against the walls. Some fellows wiped tears from their eyes. Afterward, as the students crowded around her, one young girl hesitated at the back. She was about 12, with tight curls pulled into braids and a backpack too big for her shoulders. Finally, she stepped forward. "Captain Whitmore," she asked shyly. "I'm not supposed to be here. My sister's the one in the program. I just came with her, but I wanted to meet you." Emma crouched slightly, steadying herself on her cane to meet the girl's eyes. "What's your name, Naomi?" the girl whispered. "And what do you dream of?" Naomi bit her lip. "To fly, but everyone says it's too hard, too expensive, too far away." Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn coin and old token from the New York subway, polished by years of touch. She pressed it into Naomi's hand. "This isn't much, but it's a reminder. Every journey begins with one step or one seat. Hold on to this. One day, you'll give it to someone else." Naomi's eyes widened, tears forming. She clutched the coin tightly. That evening, Zoe recorded Emma reflecting privately. "She reminded me of Elena, not in her face, but in her fire. That quiet kind of courage. You can see it if you look closely enough." Weeks later, Naomi's sister confirmed that Naomi had started saving her allowance for flight lessons. She carried the coin everywhere, rubbing it like a talisman before exams. As months passed, Emma's health grew frailer, but she refused to retreat from public life. She recorded video messages for fellows around the world, each one a mix of humor, wisdom, and stubborn hope. One of her last major appearances was at the United Nations in New York. Delegates from dozens of countries gathered to hear her speak at a summit on dignity in global industries. She walked slowly to the podium, her cane steady, her breath measured. Cameras clicked, lights blazed, but she seemed undistracted. 10 years ago, she began, a woman kept her seat on a flight. That's all, but the truth is, none of us sits alone. Every seat carries history. Every seat carries responsibility. Today, I ask you not just to keep yours, but to share it. Build tables wide enough for everyone. That's the revolution. And it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to whoever chooses it next. Her words drew a standing ovation that lasted long after she left the stage. Not long after, Emma returned to her apartment in Queens, where snow once again dusted the window panes. One evening, as she sat quietly with Zoe, she confessed, "I don't fear the end. I just hope the story keeps moving without me." Zoe squeezed her hand. "It will, because you passed it on. That's how stories live." Emma smiled faintly. Then it's time. When she passed away months later, tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Airlines painted her name on planes. Schools named scholarships in her honor. Pilots flew missing man formations over airports in silent tribute. And at her funeral, Naomi, now 15, stood nervously at the podium, the subway token still in her pocket. Her voice shook, but her words cut clear. "Captain Whitmore gave me a coin, but what she really gave me was belief. Belief that a girl like me could fly. Someday, I'll sit in the cockpit, and when I do, I'll keep my seat for her, for Elena, for all of us." The crowd wept openly. Marcus Reed, frail in his wheelchair, whispered to Zoe, "There it is, the torch, passed." Naomi looked out at the sea of mourners, then upward, as if toward skies waiting to be claimed. And in that moment, the revolution that had begun in silence, on a single flight, lived again, not as memory, but as promise. 10 years had passed since Emma Whitmore's funeral, but her words still rang in Naomi Johnson's ears. She was no longer the shy 12-year-old clutching a subway token. At 22, Naomi stood in her crisp cadet uniform on the tarmac at Dallas-Fort Worth, staring at the sleek GlobalAir A350 that would soon carry her on her first solo international route. The air smelled of jet fuel and morning dew. Mechanics bustled. Ground crew shouted over engines. And the rising sun set the aircraft aglow like a promise. Naomi exhaled, steadying her nerves. In her pocket, the subway token rested, warm from her touch. She whispered, "This is for you, Captain Whitmore, for you, Ms. Brooks, for all of us." Inside the terminal, cameras clicked. Zoe Kim, older now but with the same restless energy, filmed the moment for what she called her final installment. The documentary would follow Naomi's journey, completing the arc that had begun decades earlier with Elena Brooks refusing to give up her seat. Reporters jostled for space. "Naomi, how does it feel to be the youngest black woman to captain a commercial international flight?" one shouted. Naomi gave a measured smile. "It feels like responsibility, not achievement. Elena Brooks kept her seat so we could sit here today. Emma Whitmore passed the torch. I'm just carrying it forward." Her words trended within minutes. Hashtags filled social media. Naomi's wings, keep your seat, Flight 32 legacy. The passengers boarding that morning were aware of the significance, too. Some paused to shake her hand. Others whispered blessings as they stepped onto the jet. An older woman pressed a note into her palm that read, "Fly safe, baby. We prayed for this day." When Naomi entered the cockpit, her breath caught. The seat seemed larger than life, wrapped in history and expectation. She ran her fingers across the controls. whispering the checklist like a prayer. Her co-pilot, Daniel Vega, grinned. First time's always the hardest. After that, it's just sky and steel. Naomi chuckled nervously. Sky and steel and history sitting on your shoulders. He gave her a reassuring nod. Then let's make history fly. As the plane taxied to the runway, Naomi's mind flickered back to the letter she had written Emma years ago, the one Emma never lived to read in person. In it, she had promised someday, I'll sit in the cockpit, and when I do, I'll keep my seat. Now, that promise filled her lungs like oxygen. The engines roared. The plane surged forward. Naomi's hands were steady on the yoke. The wheels lifted from the earth, and for a moment she felt suspended, not just above the ground, but above time itself, carried by the strength of those who came before. At cruising altitude, Daniel glanced at her. How does it feel? Naomi smiled, eyes glistening, like I finally understand what freedom sounds like. The passengers applauded when the intercom crackled with her voice. Good morning. This is Captain Naomi Johnson. Welcome aboard. Some cheered, others cried quietly. The flight itself was smooth, almost serene, as if the sky itself conspired to honor the occasion. But the true climax came on landing, as the wheels touched down in London. Applause erupted across the cabin. Passengers rose from their seats, phones recording, voices chanting her name. Naomi opened the cockpit door, stunned by the standing ovation. On the jet bridge, hundreds had gathered, activists, students, even dignitaries holding signs Elena's sky lives on. Emma's torch burns bright. Naomi's wings carry us forward. Naomi's throat tightened. She raised the subway token high, letting it glint in the light. This was given to me by Captain Emma Whitmore, she said into the microphones. It reminds me that every journey starts with one step, one seat. Today isn't about me. It's about continuing a revolution of dignity and grace. And it's about making sure no child, anywhere in the world, is told they don't belong in the skies. Her words ricocheted across headlines. Commentators hailed the moment as the completion of a generational arc. Activists called it proof that storytelling, when carried faithfully, could outlive even its tellers. That evening, Naomi visited the GlobalAir office in London. In the lobby, a statue of Elena Brooks and Emma Whitmore stood tall. Naomi knelt before it, placing the subway token at its base. For the first time in years, she let it go. Thank you, she whispered. You carried me this far. Now I'll carry others. Later, Zoe interviewed her in a quiet hotel room. The cameras rolled as Naomi spoke with raw honesty. I was just a little girl who didn't belong in that fellowship hall. Emma saw me. She gave me a coin and told me to build seats for others. That's what I intend to do. Flying planes is only part of it. My real job is to keep the revolution alive. Zoe, her eyes misting, whispered, and you just did. In the years that followed, Naomi launched an initiative called Seats of Grace. It funded aviation training for underprivileged youth worldwide, pairing them with mentors, scholarships, and guaranteed job placements. Within 5 years, hundreds of young pilots, many women, many from marginalized backgrounds entered the industry through her program. Naomi refused to be called a hero. heroes are past tense, she said at the United Nations. I'm just a participant in a relay. I carried the baton because Emma handed it to me, and when the time comes, I'll hand it off too. Her humility only deepened her influence. When asked why she never kept the subway token, Naomi smiled. Because it doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to the next child who thinks they don't belong. And when I meet them, I'll pass it on. The story came full circle at a fellowship graduation in Dallas. Naomi, now seasoned and confident, spotted a young boy standing nervously at the back of the room. His shoes were worn, his eyes uncertain. She crouched down, meeting his gaze. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eli," he whispered. "And what do you dream of?" Eli, his answer was soft but certain. "To fly." Naomi reached into her pocket and pressed something into his hand. Not the subway token, but a new token she carried for moments like this. "Then take this, hold it close, and remember every seat you keep makes room for another." Eli's eyes shone with the same fire Emma had once seen in Naomi. And so, the revolution moved again, from hand to hand, heart to heart, sky to sky. The years rolled by like a quiet tide, each one carrying Naomi Johnson further from her first triumphant flight and deeper into a life shaped by both duty and grace. At 68, she no longer flew commercial routes, though her hands still twitched sometimes at the memory of throttles and yokes. Instead, she spent her days mentoring, speaking, and watching as the skies filled with faces that once would have been told, "You don't belong here." From her porch in Houston, Naomi often watched contrails stripe the horizon. Each white line reminded her of Elena Brooks, Emma Whitmore, and the many nameless passengers whose courage or witness had fueled the movement. The revolution no longer felt fragile, no longer a single spark at risk of being smothered. It had grown into a fire steady, sustainable, illuminating skies across the globe. Her home had become a gathering place. Young fellows and pilots in training often visited, eager to hear her stories firsthand. Naomi never glamorized them. She described the fear in Elena's voice, the weariness in Emma's eyes, the sting of being doubted. She wanted them to understand the cost of progress, not just the victories. One summer evening, a group of cadets sat in her living room, notebooks open, phones recording. Naomi sipped her tea before speaking. "You've heard the headlines. You've seen the documentaries. But here's the truth, they weren't superheroes. Elena was just tired of moving. Emma was just tired of being invisible. I was just a little girl with a coin. The miracle isn't that we were extraordinary. It's that ordinary choices became extraordinary because we refused to back down." The cadets nodded, some scribbling furiously, others simply staring in awe. Naomi chuckled. "Don't look at me like that. The world doesn't need more statues. It needs more people willing to stand or sit when it counts." Later that night, when the cadets had gone, Naomi sat with Zoe Kim, now retired but still filming, her camera smaller and lighter, her hair silver. Zoe was working on what she called her last film, a tapestry of all the lives touched by the movement. "You've carried this story longer than anyone," Zoe said softly. "Do you ever feel it's too heavy?" Naomi looked at the sky again, where another jet traced its path. "It's lighter now, because it's not mine anymore. I've passed it on too many times to count. Every fellow, every pilot, every child who dares to dream it's theirs now." Zoe lowered the camera, and when you're gone, Naomi smiled, tired but certain. When I'm gone, the skies will still hum with the sound of belonging. That's enough. Her words proved prophetic. At 81, Naomi attended what would be her final public ceremony, the unveiling of the GlobalAir Institute for Equity in Aviation. A sleek building of glass and steel, it bore not just her name, but Elena's and Emma's carved side by side. Inside, a wall displayed the subway token under glass, with an inscription, "Every journey begins with one seat kept." Standing at the podium, Naomi's voice wavered with age but not conviction. "This isn't my monument. It's yours. Use it. Fill it with stories bigger than mine." The crowd roared, knowing they were witnessing the close of an era. Months later, Naomi's health began to decline. Her body grew frail, her movement slower, but her mind remained sharp. She spent long afternoons dictating letters, answering emails from young dreamers, and recording voice notes filled with advice and encouragement. One evening, Eli, the boy she had once given a token to, visited. Now, in his 40s, a seasoned pilot himself, he knelt by her chair. "You kept your promise," Naomi whispered. "You flew." Eli's eyes glistened. "Because you believed in me when no one else did." She reached for his hand. "Then promise me you'll believe in someone else. That's how it never ends." He nodded, tears slipping free. When Naomi passed peacefully in her sleep that winter, the world mourned but did not crumble, because by then the revolution was not a fragile flame but a constellation thousands of lives lit by one refusal to move. Her funeral filled a hangar in Dallas, planes parked outside like silent sentinels. Pilots from every major airline attended, many wearing patches that read, "I could keep your seat." Speeches echoed through the vast space, each one weaving Naomi's name with Elena's and Emma's, 3 lives braided into one enduring story. But the most powerful moment came when Naomi's great-granddaughter, a child of just 10, stood at the podium clutching a small wooden box. She opened it, revealing a token new, freshly minted, etched with the words, "Dignity is non-negotiable." She held it high. "Grandma Naomi said every journey starts with one seat. I'm going to carry this until it's time to give it to someone else." The crowd erupted in applause, tears streaming freely. Zoe, now too frail to lift her camera, whispered to those nearby, and so it begins again. Outside, as dusk settled, a formation of jets flew low overhead, their engines thundering in tribute. The sound rattled the hangar, vibrating through every chest, a reminder that the revolution had not ended, it had simply taken new wings, and somewhere, in classrooms, in cockpits, in the hearts of children who dared to dream, the torch burned on. The story of a woman denied her seat only to reveal she owned the airline teaches us something far greater than a single act of justice. It reminds us that dignity is not negotiable. Life will hand us moments when others question our worth, our right to be where we are. In those moments, we face a choice to shrink or to stand. But standing doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means staying calm, holding your ground, and letting the truth reveal itself in its own power. The strength of the story lies not only in exposing prejudice, but in transforming it, turning humiliation into reform, and insult into inspiration. For older generations, it echoes memories of battles fought for respect, fairness, and belonging. For younger ones, it is a call to continue the relay to carry forward what was hard won. The lesson is simple, yet profound. When you claim your rightful seat, you make space for others to sit as well, and that ripple can last long after you're gone. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like these only matter when they're carried in the hearts of people like you. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps us bring more powerful stories of dignity, justice, and hope to life. Your support keeps this conversation alive.